Welcome to this Education and Philosophy podcast, part of a series introducing key ideas in education and philosophy. The ideas covered in this series are discussed in relation to their potential use to present-day thought and practice. This series draws from the book Education and Philosophy, published by Sage, to which there is a link below. In this podcast, I will briefly discuss medieval scholasticism, which, as a philosophical system and as a mode of teaching, was closely tied to the birth of the European university in the mid-12th century. I will explain how scholasticism functioned and why scholasticism looks so odd to us now, by showing how it upsets some fundamental modern assumptions about education. To understand scholasticism, what it set out to achieve, it is important to appreciate the intellectual context of medieval Europe. In this context, the Bible and a range of associated holy texts were treated as the supreme authority in all worldly and otherworldly matters. Ancient secular knowledge was relegated to a subordinate position. Much had indeed been lost following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, with secular teachings such as those of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, preserved outside Europe by Arabic scholars. These ancient secular texts were only gradually reintroduced to Western Europe, and this was on the condition that they were carefully adapted to Christian tradition. Scholasticism was a mode of study and a method of teaching. Through teaching and through study, it attempted to achieve a harmonious interpretation of the various sacred texts and the growing body of secular texts that were returning to Western Europe. Not only did secular texts sometimes appear to challenge sacred or holy texts in their interpretations of the world, sacred texts were themselves also sometimes in disagreement with one another. Fundamental disagreement or divergent interpretations could not be allowed according to this system of thought. These disagreements seemingly undermined the divine authority that was thought to rule over all understanding. The task for scholasticism was to bring these texts back into alignment. Scholasticism has been retrospectively ridiculed for its diligent pursuit of harmony, for its ability to argue away inconvenient and contradictory ideas. If it looks ridiculous, it is perhaps only because we judge scholasticism according to modern prejudices, most notably the idea that the purpose of education is to help us to think independently, that is to say, unrestrained by tradition. In the work of Alasdair MacIntyre, in particular his book Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, but also After Virtue, which is his most famous, we encounter an attempt to do just that. MacIntyre attempts to offer a more sympathetic account of the scholastic worldview. The key figure for MacIntyre was the 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas helped develop a mode of scholastic debate that coupled deep respect for authority with an attempt to resolve contradiction and thereby reaffirm the wisdom of the sacred texts. In the medieval university, there was no pretense that truth is an independent or neutral entity. Knowledge of the truth did not emerge from empirical sources or through the application of a mathematical, computational logic. Rather, truth was arrived at by way of the correct reading of texts. Only those who had mastered a tradition of thought and belief could produce such readings. To correctly read texts, you had to become the right kind of person. You had to be accepted into and submit yourself to the prevailing moral order. This looks odd to us now because the Enlightenment belief that rational thought must emancipate itself from the tutelage of authority, as Kant put it, still endures. It is because of this belief that we find scholasticism so strange. According to an Enlightenment worldview, to be rational, one must think for oneself. This idea persists even though there are many good reasons for contesting the notion that one could ever be in that position. A position to think with the independence of thought implied by thinking for oneself. By contrast, scholastic rationalism could be said to be more honest in recognizing that it depended on an external framework that made thought and debate possible. This intellectual framework was not rigidly enforced. Its transmission was relatively subtle. The dogmas of scholastic tradition largely took the form of tacit or unspoken understandings and principles. These were absorbed gradually through, for example, attendance at and participation in the debates or disputations that accompanied lectures. In the scholastic university, intellectual and moral virtues were deemed inseparable. Of particular concern here were the effects of personal desires and inclinations. These were to be guarded against through an education in personal conduct. The apprentice would learn to regulate the self, working towards an ideal that was, in part, exemplified by the work of the masters in whom the scholar was expected to place all trust. With modernity, this older moral order breaks down. As MacIntyre argues, modernity is characterized by a fragmentation of morality. There is, across post-Enlightenment societies, no general, agreed moral order. As a result, the moral meaning and integrity of a practice like education is lost. Its essential purposes are abandoned to the play of power. With modernity, we reach a situation where, as MacIntyre argues, both individuals and groups debate one another from incommensurable, that is to say, irreconcilable moral positions. To quote MacIntyre, we scarcely have enough agreement to be able to arrive at a common mind about what it is that we should be quarrelling about. The moral fragmentations of modernity pose real dilemmas for today's educational establishments that seek to civilize their students according to the norms of a society whose moral frameworks remain uncertain. This is why the teaching profession has come to represent, quoting MacIntyre, the forlorn hope of the culture of Western modernity. In modernity, the teaching profession is set a task that it cannot possibly fulfill. If scholasticism looks odd, as a rival system of education, it at least shows that things could be different. These ideas are discussed in more detail in Chapter 4 of Education and Philosophy. If you would like to hear another podcast discussing a key idea related to education and philosophy, click below. Thank you for listening.